And we're good to go. All right, good. So hi, everyone. My name is Julian from the Awakening from the Meaning Crisis Discord server. I am here with Aji, and we are going to be talking today about Bildung and how that relates to the world as it is, and also to our world, which is in particular the question of the individual and the community. Hi, Aji.
Hi, how are you? Good morning to you.
Yes, and good afternoon to you. So what I'm going to do is introduce Aji too. Aji and I got to know each other a little bit over the community, I don't know, a few weeks ago. And really do like Aji very much because he's got a good open spirit and from everything I can see, a lot to share. So a little bit of background on Aji. Am I saying that correctly, Aji?
Yes, that's perfect.
Okay. So grew up in the United States, Catholic family. Your father was a school teacher and both parents veterans of the fight for social justice in the 60s and 70s. Aji's grandparents came from Mexico, hardworking but with little money. And Aji had a wide spectrum of formative cultural experiences across the United States, Southern Texas, Washington, D.C., New England, and now California, where I'm now a business and technology expert working at a Silicon Valley startup in the field of artificial intelligence. On the brink of a major social political event here in America, I see a need for healing, communication, and stronger leadership. One way or another, we are going to have to rebuild our country, says Aji. Now with the pandemic, we find ourselves isolated in some ways, but also more connected globally through virtual channels, such as this one, servers and online video classrooms. It was so many causes and conditions that brought the Bildung topic to Aji, but instantly resonated with it, believing perhaps in a rediscovered source of harmonizing human beings. Is there a role for this old idea in a new virtual global community? Which is perfect. So I'm going to do an intro to the Bildung, and anything you wanted to add to that intro, Aji, before we do?
No, that was great, Jules. Just really looking forward to this discussion and excited to see where we take it. So carry on.
Me too. I love your energy. Thanks to my dad for some feedback, and also to Mark Lefebvre from our community, who was very constructive and generous with the feedback on the first Dialogos. We're going to do an introduction so that people watching can get into the topic quicker and see what Aji and I saw a little bit of time ago. So I'm going to share my screen and do the presentation. Okay, you can see that okay, Aji?
Sure can.
All right, great. So the topic of our Dialogos today is going to be Bildung and the Tonos of the individual and the community. This topic started because, I don't know, was it a week ago or so, Aji, maybe a bit longer, we connected about this podcast with Thomas Björkman, who is a Dialogos partner with John Vervaeke from our server. And both of us saw something really important in it. It was a good podcast with 4 people from the Growing Down podcast. It was really helpful to get that many perspectives. So what I'm going to do is a quick introduction to Bildung. I've spent the last week or so researching so that we can have a tighter definition, because it is quite a, don't know if you found this, Aji, or not, but it's quite a nebulous thing to define. So I'm going to try and tighten that up a little bit now. So here is how Björkman and his co-author Lena Andersson from Denmark define Bildung. It's the way that the individual matures and takes upon his or herself ever bigger personal responsibility towards family, friends, fellow citizens, society, humanity, the globe, and the global heritage of our species, while enjoying ever bigger personal, moral, and existential freedoms. It's the enculturation, lifelong learning that forces us to grow and change. It is existential and emotional depth, lifelong interaction and struggles with new knowledge, culture, art, science, new perspectives, new people, new truths, and it is being an active citizen in adulthood. And then finally, it is a constant process that never ends, something I find personally appealing. That's a definition straight out of Thomas and Lena's book, which is called The Nordic Secret. And I'm just going to finish off by summarising how they've approached this issue through the book. Thomas' background is in business, so I think he's used to having to deliver in a way that talks to people directly and practically. And this is how they've gone about it. They talk about scales of development that are more or less taken as real. I don't have a better way to put it. There are 3 scales that they're interested in: our moral development, our development as an ego, as a person, and then how we belong. So I'm just going to show you how they're looking at that. So everybody grows up through time. Just going to get that thumbnail down a little bit. And they talk about from Kohlberg, I think it's Lawrence Kohlberg in the 1920s came up with this scale. And when you're younger, you're basically morally caring about, is mum or dad going to tell me off? As you develop into your teens, you're getting into, okay, I'm pretty self-focused. How do I get what I want? Then you start getting interactions with the wider community and you think, oh, I better stay safe and conform. As you mature as an adult, you start thinking for yourself a bit more, so you can think about ways to serve into the greater society. And then as you develop even more fully, hopefully, you start caring about even the wider community as a whole. Next scale, ego. This comes from Keegan, Robert Keegan. And Keegan's studies show that there's 5 phases along the same lines: self-discovering, consolidating, governing, authoring, transforming. So a person widens up the more mature they become in their ego, hopefully. Circles of belonging. So whether we like it or not, we're all ensconced within communities. And this is a bit more detailed, but basically they're drawing on a survey by a person whose name I can't pronounce right now, so I'll have to refer to it later. But basically you're going from ego, family, your in-group, the nation, the culture zone, humanity, and then the planet. That we, whether we're realizing it or not, have a sense of belonging in those communities. What Björkman and Anderson were trying to do is incorporate those different models into a single apprehensible model. And they're saying it's a bit more like a sphere. It's like a fruit ripens. So if we're developing well, we're also going to become wider and stronger. And they have a couple of vectors, I suppose, where on the horizontal, you're growing wider in your knowledge through the culture of facts and knowledge. But on your own scale, they're saying as you go deeper, you become a deeper person, you can get in touch with the meaning of your emotional experience. As you go higher with your aspirations, you get in touch with more of the moral core, I suppose, and spiritual core that drives values. The last thing I'm going to end on is that the story that they're telling is you can see how we historically as a society, and they are specifically focused on the West and their region, the Nordic countries. What if we applied that scale of growth to what we see in history? So there's the complexity scale. Oops, okay, my flags are a bit out, sorry. But if you have a look at the time scale, you can see from about 500 odd years ago in the Renaissance to the current day, there's a few key figures. So you could say that the ego of the West, oh man, my animation didn't work, sorry. If you started down here with the ego stage, you've got Lawrence de Medici. So you could say we're waking up, we're coming into the Renaissance, the flowering of referring back to the classical period. You're not just a mindless entity, you have the capacity to be creative. That was my own throwing that in there, by the way. I don't think that's in the book. Where Bildung starts to come into it is the Pietist movement. So in what's now Germany, the folks there started to say, well, we're not just going to be slavishly tied to a Christian religion, in this case, Protestantism. We're going to think for ourselves and we're going to be wholehearted about this. And Bildung was the idea of developing yourself towards the image of God. That chapter there, where we're rising to the in-group, very, very important. That's the 3rd Earl of Shaftesbury, someone who I became acquainted with more because of Mark Vernon over in the UK. Just an incredible figure. I hope we get a chance to talk about him a bit, Aji, but basically he is accredited with coming up with the original ideology of Bildung. And the short story is, in 17th century England, he was the protege of John Locke, someone, Aji, who your founding fathers took immense inspiration from. John Locke was the Earl of Shaftesbury's medical attendant, the first Earl of Shaftesbury, but basically they were partners in the project of politics. In any case, let's just say that the 3rd Earl of Shaftesbury started talking about inner transformation, and this had a very wide-reaching effect across the UK. So some of the flags down the bottom there, by the way, you can see that's the UK flag as it was around about 300 years ago. And so he's having an influence on the kind of people that influence our whole, to use John Vervaeke's language, cultural cognitive grammar. People like David Hume, the great empiricist, and Adam Smith, the father of economics over there in Scotland. They really liked Shaftesbury's idea. And after John Locke, apparently Shaftesbury's writings were the most popular in England. Have I still got you, Aji? I'm nearly done.
I'm right here, loving it.
Oh, good. Thanks, man. So what happens is that Shaftesbury's writings in the early 18th century, so we're starting to talk about the 1730s and so on, around about 250 odd years ago, gets translated. He was using the word inner formation. And to my understanding, he was basically a Stoic. He did all of the nodding to the Christian orthodoxy of the time, but he, like John Vervaeke again, is saying, hey, if you aim yourself to a life of virtue, it's going to form you in the right kind of way. If you aim yourself towards the good, the true, and the beautiful, and I think beauty in particular mattered to him. So this concept of inner formation got translated to Bildung, in German. So they are kind of appropriating the term from the Pietists, but now it's becoming secular along with the Enlightenment. And at this particular point, we have to talk about how all of the figures that are just little pictures on this graph, they're ensconced in a world just like we are, and they're looking at the problems of their age. And so this is all reactions to and solutions to the issues of their time. So the chap you've got there is Herder, who was a very famous writer who really took the Bildung concept to heart. And these people are all focusing on the fact of saying, what we need to do is get away from being told by the religious mores, say, of Christian Europe. I am a Christian, by the way. This isn't a Christian bashing exercise. This is just trying to put it into context. And they're saying, hey, we want people to think for themselves. We want people to grow. We don't want them to just be mindlessly repeating the orthodoxies of the church or being crushed by the authoritarian state. We want people to grow. And so these Enlightenment thinkers were writing about processes like Bildung, really emphasizing personal freedom, and the two go hand in hand. And so what you get with Herder is a sense of nationality, because at the time there's all of these different states across Europe that are completely isolated in certain ways. It's our tribe and your tribe. There is a common religion, but that doesn't count for much, I suppose, beyond enforcing the state and, you know, your own tribal connections. So he comes up with the idea of Geist, which means spirit and a national spirit. So the idea of the higher consciousness of a nation starts to become realized in people. Other people alongside, that's not him, but Goethe is a very famous author in Germany. He's many other things, but basically, or Prussia at the time, also developing this idea of Bildung in very, very popular writings within Prussia at the time and Greater Europe. This becomes a realized fact in around about 1810 when Wilhelm von Humboldt actually formalizes Bildung as the ideological principle of education in Berlin. So Humboldt University in Berlin is named after he and his very famous brother. So it actually becomes a formal thing. Bildung is now taught as a practice. Around about between 1848 and 1871, and Aji, this is where I think our conversation might become interesting as well, is that Otto von Bismarck basically wants to bring order to the chaos going on at that time. And through a very conservative and strict chancellorship, takes Prussia into German unification. And this is where we see the departure from Bildung as the idea of what we're going to be doing is transforming people and letting them have the freedom to transform into, we're going to have an education system that is good for the industry. We're going to put people into strict schools, which are basically military style. And it was that school system which got imported into the United States, ultimately, as far as I understand it. So where did Bildung go? Goes over to Denmark with characters like that epic-looking guy, Grundqvist, I think it was, who's called the Danish Moses. Basically an inspiring guy. And from there to where you've got a picture of Chomsky up there is the story of Thomas and Liana's book. They talk about how the Nordic countries, Denmark, Norway, Sweden, through implementing Bildung as a grassroots, let's get these dirt poor farmers, and through social activism and trying to work within the political system on a Bildung principle, they managed, according to the story, to transform those countries from basically starvation to world leaders. So I'm going to just about finish. I really appreciate your patience, Aji. I put in there the Pax Americana, okay? After World War II, what's happened? Where has Bildung gone? Even in the Nordic countries, as they say in the book, Coca-Cola and Disney. So we're all getting fatter, happier, and richer, but probably, sorry, not happier, but the meaning crisis, let's put it that way. Chomsky refers every time he talks about education to Wilhelm von Humboldt and Bildung, not explicitly. And up the top there, we've got Thomas and Liana. So that's enough of an intro. I'm going to stop sharing there. Thanks for your patience there, Aji. You still with me?
Yeah, I am. Thanks. That was such a great history. I really appreciated that.
Oh, thank you for your patience there. I'm just going to stop sharing and okay. So do you want to just take it away? I'd really be interested in hearing.
Sure. Yeah, first of all, yeah, thank you for inviting me, and thank you for putting together that presentation, because it's, I'm learning every conversation we have, and I really enjoy that. It's fascinating when you look back through history against, the veil of what's happening in that time and era, and what kind of blooms out of it. And it's harder to step away from where we are today and get that same perspective. So that's what I love about history, is it kind of lets you get out of your own perspective for a minute. And I guess there's so many places we could go to have this discussion, because I think there's a lot of topics that instantly are fascinating to me. The personal development aspect of this, kind of your own moral, virtuous journey, the aspects of responsibility, and the path that takes from like local roots to national, global, humanistic, sentient destinations. And then also just sort of like the battle between some of these ideas and then the commercialization, the Disney and the Coca-Cola. I mean, all of those are great conversations to have. I'm probably and I'm willing, yeah, I'm eager to have any of those. So I don't know if that's enough to kind of fuel your thoughts on where to take us.
Oh, plenty. I'm just really excited to talk to you. I have this sense about you that you're a really good person to talk to about these things. And when I was, as you know, I was listening to the podcast, and for some reason you popped into my head, and I thought I'd share it. And for whatever reason, it resonated with you. So that's really interesting to me. Maybe we're picking up on something, and that'd be good to explore. But I suppose when I was thinking, Arji, about what we're going to be talking about today, what I wanted to ask you first of all is, when you were listening, can you remember to the podcast? Can you remember what your impressions were? Like, what impressed you that sort of sparked something?
Yeah, I think, first of all, anytime we rediscover something that we've learned 100 years ago, I think that's always interesting to me, because that's like the foundational purpose of history, right? Is to go find the things we've forgotten. So that grabbed me first and foremost, and that it was being rediscovered and re-explored. But the specific concepts, I think, that jumped at me and resonated with me have a lot to do with the same reason that I'm, our Discord and work we're learning with John is also so resonating. It's just the idea of self and being, and what's happening to the individual self within the scope of these topics, right? Like, what's happening to me as an individual, my personal growth and responsibility. Like, there's an aspect of basic human development that's, integral to what he was talking about, which has this big national communal benefit. And I mean, that's a winning combination. I think when those two things really start harmonizing together, wow, I can improve myself and I can improve everything around me. That's something I really want to explore a little further. Right?
The win-win.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. Well, I suppose what that makes me think of is back to the third Earl of Shaftesbury. It's just such an interesting story, Arji, I got to tell you. So I watched another discussion that Thomas has another organization that he set up called Perspectiva. And Thomas lives in Stockholm, I think, in Sweden, where my wife is from. It's another angle of interest for me. But they had a discussion. As I said, there was a chap on there called Mark Vernon. He's fairly well known. He's been on a Voices with Viveki. And he started talking about Shaftesbury. So why I bring that in is because in his context, this goes to the whole thing about self-development and how it plays into the bigger whole, the win-win. In his context, so this is, I think his dates were, late 1600s. So he's born into basically the highest privilege. But at a time when the community that he was part of, the United Kingdom, is sort of racked by massive social change. So you had all of the wars between the Parliament and the King, and then the King comes back and puts down the Parliament, and there's this dialogue of violence and all sorts of things happening. But at the same time, the outworkings of the scientific revolution. His name was Anthony Ashley Cooper, but I'm just going to call him Shaftesbury. He, as I said, he was raised by John Locke. So your founders, in terms of intellectually he was raised, your founders looked to John Locke to write the Constitution. Thomas Jefferson, the idea of life, liberty, property. They take that from John Locke. Shaftesbury's, there in the house with Shaftesbury. But the thing about John Locke, and, you would have heard this in John Viveki's, I really like how he did the sort of philosophical history first. Mm-hmm. And John Locke, and there was this other leading politician and thinker, Thomas Hobbes. Mm. You know how John talks about Thomas Hobbes was really doing like initial artificial intelligence?
I haven't heard that talk, but I'm fascinated already.
Yeah. Oh, totally. It's such an interesting link because both. You see, the thing about Thomas Hobbes, just on the political thing, just quickly, is that he's basically saying, have a look around us. There's all of this chaos and there's this war and it's violent. And he's well known for the saying something like life is in the state of nature, something like nasty, brutish, short, etc. So he's basically saying we need to have a strong authoritarian leader to keep everybody in check, because human nature is basically what he says, it's the war of all against all. He's also a proponent of what's called the mechanical philosophy. In other words, that the way the universe works, I believe including us, is mechanical. It's, things bumping into each other. There's organizing principles which work like a machine. John Locke is also famous for his political work. But he's saying, okay, it's not quite as bad as Thomas Hobbes says, but, we do still need to keep people in check. That's why we need a limited government to do protection of life, liberty, and property. And obviously the Americans went with him.
Well, I love the model, the whole concept behind mechanical. It sounds a little too predictable to me, but if there's some chaos theory mixed in there, maybe they're onto something.
Yeah, well, I think that's critical. And this is I'm going on a little bit, but Shaftesbury is basically, he's raised in that framework, and John Locke is famous for the tabula rasa, that we are basically impressed on by the world. We don't have our own inner world as such. Impressions come on us, and that's how the world is, empiricism. Shaftesbury is so important because he's saying, hey, both to Hobbes and Locke, we're not just these selfish people who are out for ourselves. We've actually got this inner world which is powerful upon us. It drives us. He called it sentiments. We have these feelings which are powerful, and we're drawn to virtue. We're drawn to each other to treat each other well, actually. It's just basically completely challenging that whole thing. And that's why his ideas spread out. So that's just to support your idea that it's not just me versus the rest of the world. It can be win-win.
Yeah, and both can be true, right? I think there is like a natural, Thomas talked about some of the tensions in the model, and I think what you just described, there's some natural tensions there too, right? Letting the world imprint upon me how I'm going to behave, versus listening to sort of these inner urges or inner pathways that want me to go in another direction, and generally, I'm a believer that those are generally virtuous directions. We kind of want to do things that, bring about happier feelings or, more joyful environment to ourselves. So I think those things are in tension. And I think it's interesting because it sounds like the Earl was on to this idea of sort of, I'm having this own sense of spontaneity within myself that I need to develop and educate and I think ultimately institutionalize, right?
Oh, that's spot on. I'm really interested to hear, I guess, do you have some experience firsthand of that tension that you've seen, or that it makes it clear to you?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think the last 4 years are a shining amplification of that in here in the States. I don't think I've ever seen a time where I've seen those tensions greater, right? People have ignored a lot of their own natural sense to interact with their society in a way that's well behaved or decent, and I think has kind of yielded to the influence of all this stuff that we're being saturated with, and sort of the mental modality that this environment wants us to behave in, which is separated and in tension with each other for whatever reasons, intentional or otherwise. That's I think sort of summarizes where we're at here, and I think things are certainly fueling up for us here. We're on the eve of a few days before our big national election, and yeah, I think people really struggle, wherever their beliefs lie, or wherever their loyalties lie politically. People, I think, across the board are struggling with that tension between sort of giving in and yielding to that environment pressure, which could also be peer groups, could be groups on Facebook, it could be wherever you're living, whatever domain is influencing you. That influence has gotten a lot stronger in the last 4, 5, 10 years. It's institutionalized, with things like social media and all those big tech influences. That's a different kind of influence than we've ever seen before, and so people are just inundated with this tension, and it's getting harder and harder to stand out and have your own thoughts and push against that, or forward an idea that's against that. People I think that I see are really struggling with that.
Yeah, what jumps out to me in what you said there, first of all, Aji, is the bad kind of tension.
Yeah, I'm glad you said that, because tension in of itself isn't bad, right? That was another great thing that Thomas brought up, and I was hoping we would talk about today as well. Yeah, it's not the bad kind of tension. It's not good or bad. Maybe tension is not the right word. It's just sort of an influence to conform to a certain way of thinking. And if anything, maybe it's a tendency to want us to take comfort in the mainstream way of thinking and being. And Thomas suggested in his in his podcast, that we actually have to get used to being uncomfortable. We have to embrace some discomfort if we're going to break out of that mold. And I think right now the pressure is to remove tension, remove discomfort from from a lot of our our communities, and that's maybe the wrong instinct, is what Thomas suggested.
Okay. Yeah. It sort of jumped out at me when you talked about it, because you're living in it, and for us, we get impressions from Twitter or whatever, like a headline that talks about what's going on. And I'm really interested in how you were saying there's the kind of tension which is leading to some kind of critical break, like a bad kind of a break. But then there's a good kind of attention on of the type that you're noticing with Tonos.
Yeah, and I think, just thinking through it, if I were to sort of restate the dynamic, I think we're living in a time where people want to be really comfortable. They want to, have life to be good, and they want it to be easy. And when it's not, when some issue comes up, whether it's economics or some other pressure, it's really easy to kind of use people's intolerance for that discomfort and sort of take them down a path that says, here, I can make you comfortable. You just have to think this way and act this way and say these things, and you can join our group and be comfortable within our group and feel better. And I think that's the tension, that it's sort of like drawing you away from actually dealing with the real problem and sort of integrating the whole community together. It's a disintegrating process, because if everybody's sort of taking to their sides and becoming more polarized, it's very difficult to solve the fundamental problems that we have. And I think that people maybe feel that having that peer group and that alignment, albeit very polarized, is a more comfortable place to be. And it's a lot harder place to sit down with someone who believes something very different and kind of work through. That is hard. That is very difficult. And I think we're actually losing the ability to do that. And I think, going back to Bildung, the piece that really stood out to me, and why it's aligned with all these things we're talking about, is that there's this concept of reconstruction that I think is necessary. I mean, we're already at the point where we have a lot of things we need to reconstruct in our society, certainly in the States and then globally, but we don't have a framework for that, really. And here's a framework that is based on some fundamental principles of, both moral or virtuous self and ego, and a communal aspect of belonging that, seems like a pretty good framework to go assemble a system of education, that teaches people to be better and then make their community better. And that community can extend from local physical geographies to peer groups or intellectual virtual communities. So that's a whole new dimension we didn't have 10, 15 years ago. Jumping online, getting in groups with people all over the country, and kind of reforming the way you look at things and see the world around you. So I don't know, I may be sort of babbling here a little bit, but it's actually this whole new world that I think is out there to re-educate ourselves on.
Yeah, no, you're not babbling, RG. You're right on track. I think I appreciated very much what you were saying about taking comfort in the tribe, for want of a better word, just to summarize it quickly. But also what was jumping out at me towards the end there, when you were saying how there is a new dimension with the technology. And first of all, I was thinking, well, that's funny, because we're kind of doing a bit of a Bildung thing here now with the Dialogos, using the technology. That's a good start. But then the converse, which is, I think you've been careful the way you're talking, but you're basically saying some of these social media amplifiers mainly are havens for kind of, what would you say, like anti-Bildung or reverse Bildung. Is that fair characterization?
Yeah, I mean, that's a very clever term. I think you should hang on to that. Yeah, I think there are things that, for me, I look at what the terms I use that I like to apply as a test, a litmus test, is this something that's integrating, or is this something that's disintegrating in my life, in my path, in my journey, me as a person, people around me. And there are lots of tools and technology, and I'm in the middle of that professionally, that can make the world much more of an integrative place. But there are things that tap into the worst of our instincts that become very disintegrative. In fact, I think they can become addictive in many ways. And I think that's the line we have to be careful and look at and understand where it is, to stay on the right side of technology.
Okay. So do you think, I mean, let's put it into that context of Coca-Cola and Disney, which, you know, I'm grateful for, by the way, culturally. Coca-Cola, not so much anymore, because, you know, I've lost a bit of weight, thank God. But I think where I'm getting to a little bit is, you know, in the Cold War after World War II, where the tension, and by the way, I put John Vervaeke's word in the title of our talk, Tonos, which is the Greek word for tension. Mm. And John continuously talks about getting a good tonos. Mm. And he talks about optimal grip, like it's never just the one thing. It's like never just, oh, the answer is Bildung, or, you know, the answer is the church. It's never just the one thing. It's always a constant approaching it, getting it closer through the kind of thing we're doing like right now. But in that sort of post-war period where that's the informative culture for me, and I suppose for you too, you know, television, that kind of level of consciousness that goes with popular culture and the massive rise in information, but not just information, but awareness, you know. I'm growing up in the 1980s, Ajir, and we had, you know, on TV, We Are the World and Aid for Africa. And I remember feeling, you know, guilty because I didn't care about the children in Africa who I'd never met. But, you know, it was such a forceful impression on me that it changed me. You know, the culture was changing me, but the culture was in that technology, like you're saying. And I suppose what you might be pointing to as well is that the culture is now in the newer technology in such a pernicious way, like in a really destructive way. That sounds like it really concerns you, by the way.
Yeah, I love the example that you use, because I remember that so vividly growing up in the 80s as well, and, you know, seeing these, you know, global activist events and this sort of coming together of people, and this, and going to my parents and saying, hey, we need to send in money, you know, because we need to be a part of that, and asking them about it. And so I love that we have a common experience there.
I've got I wonder, going through my head right now, sorry.
I know, I'm going to have some songs running through my mind all night. But, and I guess the aspect of Bildung that I would want to look for in all of these technologies, and or integrating these technologies in something we do, is where is the sense of belonging, right? Is there a desire? Is there a path? And is there a development of your belonging? And when technology can bring that to you, I think that's an integrative consequence. I see that as something that is positive to me and positive to other people.
Right.
And I look forward to, you know, finding places where there is tension or maybe even disagreement, because then you get to exercise what that experience is like as part of the growing process as well. So when Bildung talked about, well, we start here, but we're actually building and we're expanding, it was a constant theme that stuck out with me. You know, I think he talked about, you know, from, I'm looking at my notes, but basically starting, you know, local with some root, and then growing into your group and your community and your nation, and then globally and all of humanity and beyond. That's the vision, right? That's the fundamental vein of that vision to me, is growth. So when a technology brings something that that helps your sense of belonging, I think that's wonderful. I think that's just so fundamentally wonderful to your development as a human, meeting folks like yourself all the way around the world in a totally different time zone, and learning perspectives. And if I go into some social media and find that this is something that's driving me towards more isolation or separation, then right away that seems in strong contrast to this idea that Bildung has, which is this is about growth and this is about responsibility and connectedness, not disconnectedness.
Yeah.
And the idea of taking some principles within Bildung and applying them to a reconstruction movement within our own communities is, I'm just really fascinated by how there's something perhaps to tap into there. There's some learnings.
Yeah, that's exciting. When you were talking about that, there's a theme coming out, which is how powerfully technology could empower this kind of movement that Thomas and so on are outlining. But you know what it made me think of, Ajay, was actually was it called the Arab Spring?
Mm-hmm.
So I wanted to set that up a little bit. So I think at the Arab Spring, you had uprisings in places like Egypt a few years back. And it was seen that Facebook in particular was a massively important liberating force technologically that allowed grassroots coordination and interaction, and maybe you can even jump to earlier this year with Hong Kong and that sort of thing.
Mm-hmm.
But back to the Arab Spring, the thing that jumped out at me was a man who named his child Facebook. Because it made that strong of an impression. Like, you don't call your child Facebook unless you think this is the closest thing to a kind of a life-saving, liberty-promoting entity. So my question would be, what went wrong?
Well, it's a tool, and I think that's maybe one of the reasons I've been careful to not like name a specific platform or an entity as like a good or bad. It's a tool, and there are many wonderful things that happen on that particular platform. Many wonderful things in my own community that I see that are happening. In fact, I'm connected through a really wonderful sangha on Facebook that's in Australia, and I wouldn't be able to do that without that platform. I think that's a whole other couple-hour conversation. I think the technology and the platforms and what's happening there specifically, that to say what went wrong. I just think maybe just to put it shortly, it's a tool that can be used in for anybody's benefit, and I think there's a lot of commercial influence, and that's generated on the money that's generated on that platform is it's a lot of money. It's a lot of money, and there's people that take that very seriously, and those people don't necessarily have the same end goals in mind as many of the users on the platform. So, to put it very gently.
Yeah, and you're in the thick of it, Ajay, so I appreciate the caution. But, something dawned on me when we were tossing that idea out. Two things did. But when you brought it back to the fact that technology is a tool, which I definitely agree with, it made me go back to that sort of scale that we started with, the scale of development, and how on that complexity scale, we're talking about a technology that not only scaled, I don't know how quickly compared to the telephone, but it scaled like in 5 years to like well beyond, what the telephone did back in the turn of the century. And how if the tool, clearly there are some elements to it which are commercially driven naturally, but how also as the tool scales out into more and more people, it's meeting people at all of their different levels of development. And so what feeds back into that connective system, that network system, is all of the different levels of ego development and moral development, and it's coming back in, and you look at the tool and you say the tool's bad. But the question, what is the tool revealing as much as anything else?
Indeed, it's a mirror, right?
Have you ever looked into Marshall Mcluhan at all, Aji?
No, I haven't.
The reason I bring Marshall Mcluhan is because when television happened in the 60s, I think that was like an earthquake in the consciousness. I mean, it absolutely smashed through the book world in a way that wasn't even comprehensible. And Marshall Mcluhan was a professor of literature. He was the guy who came up with the slogan that the media is the message, which sort of became a really well-known one. Interestingly, he was also at University of Toronto, like John Vervaeke, by the way. The reason he's interesting is because when nobody had a clue as to how to even think about the effects that the technology was having, he was a self-professed man of the book. He was a professor of literature. And he's saying this suite of technologies, radio and so on, is changing you. And I have no idea how, but we should be talking about it. It's not a neutral thing. Now, there's a whole debate about, does technology change you, or maybe you're just overwhelmed by it. Maybe we can have that talk. But he started investigating this, and his big book was in 1964. It was called Understanding Media. And his basic premise was, media is not a neutral thing. When you pick up a book, it changes you in a certain way. It changes the way you cognize. This goes back to optimal grip, by the way. He even talked about this. He's saying, when you look at the media of an artwork, say that painting behind you with the guitar, he's saying, anyway, the point is that you kind of adjust yourself to get the right ratio, and you're looking at it so you get the right kind of perspective on it. You're changing yourself, you're adapting yourself, and then it changes you, and so on. That whole loop is something that he addressed as, really worth appreciating. I think how early on he was about that. And I don't know, does that spark anything for you?
Oh, it's totally relevant. Yeah, absolutely. I think the first thing that popped into my head was, one of the lectures that John put on where he talked about the split when, sort of everyone to the East continued to read the Bible out loud, and everyone on the West began to read the Bible silently. Like even that subtle shift in how people were consuming and experiencing a media at the time was had some major consequences on how they thought and how they were rationalizing ideas. Sort of an emotive, experiential type of framework, or one that was sort of rationalized in the mind. And it's such a simple thing. It never even occurred to me, but as John spoke about that in his lecture, it really stuck with me. And I've been carrying that for the last few weeks, thinking about that. And when you describe this history and this idea of media changes you, yeah, absolutely. We've always known art changes you, books change you, stories can change you. Now you've got technology that is amplified in its ability to do that at an amazingly fast pace. As fast as you can scroll, I'm going through Instagram pictures or feeds or stories on Twitter, and just the rate of media which are all psychotechnologies, are absolutely changing us, and there's no good or bad value associated with that. It's fascinating. Where are we going? I don't know. We're going to find out. That's for sure. If there's a few more fellows like the gentleman you described, if there's a few more of those fellows around, hopefully they'll guide us as we're experiencing it. They'll recognize it and perhaps even influence it.
Yeah.
But for sure, one way or the other, we're on the ride.
Yeah, that's great what you brought up, Ajay, about the Lectio Divina and reading out loud. I'd actually forgotten about that divided into East and West. That didn't even dawn on me. What it did make me think of is Mcluhan's, he postulated this position that different media attached to different senses. So the point he was trying to make, which I think goes to your point as well, is that kind of silent book reading entrains only the visual sense.
Mm-hmm.
That kind of silent, whereas the Lectio trains the oral sense. Do you know what I mean? And
Mm-hmm.
also the oral sense.
Yep.
And he's saying that massive influence of silent book reading and literature from the Gutenberg press through till television also meant that, let's say John Vervaeke's language, the cultural cognitive grammar, became very much about the sequential left to right reading of letters and words, completely focused on the one sense. And I'm just talking off the top of my head because of how that takes us out of the body as well. You know how part of our project is the embodiment of cognition and active, that kind of restoring, going back to the Bildung idea, how the book technology also, like you said, it sort of scoops us back into one sense. And it's so predominant how it filters out into other cultural areas, especially the university. Like, you're smart if you've read this many books.
Right.
But who's remembered everything that they've read? Some people, sure, but
Right. Yeah, I mean I think that's very astute. The connection of that, not just in our media, but in our educational system, right? I was an engineering major, and so the books that I read had lots of numbers and formulas and equations, and it wasn't a thrilling story. It was just it was material that had to be consumed and reasoned in the mind and rationalized and understood from that type of almost clinical perspective. And what I discovered in engineering was there was a whole other way of learning, which was I could go get an internship at the lab and go get my hands on things and play with them and break them and occasionally blow them up. And that was a whole different type of learning. And in fact, educational system in engineering embraces this now. They urge people to go do interns and get real world experience and get out there and both are important. The ideas in Bildung that Thomas talked about, incorporating like outdoors, right? Your learning is much more than just books, and it's also virtuous and ethics, but it's also playing. This idea of being outside and experiencing the world, that is so vital.
Yeah, I love that.
I often regret that after 4 years of engineering school, I never got out and rode my bike through the beautiful country of Western Massachusetts. I didn't experience that because I was here and in the lab. But I think the Bildung idea is very very broad in its perspective of integrating all these different ideas into education, and I find that fascinating.
Yeah. Oh, that's so on point what you're saying. And by the way, I'm just checking the time, so we've hit an hour, and let me know when you need
Cool.
to. Because it plays into, again, the John Vervaeke thing, that the different ways of knowing, and that, Well, I suppose what we're doing is participatory, is that at that level of connecting and identity and so on, and then there's your perspective and so on. But he emphasizes so much that at a very deep level is that embodiment of cognition. And that I've thought a little while ago about Ray Kurzweil, who must feature in your world. First of all, I was thinking about, it's a little off point, but how he's saying, to your point, that technology is a double-edged sword. You can use fire to cook with, or you can burn your house down. I think John Vervaeke talks about that as well.
Sure.
But how that idea of embodiment is essential to artificial intelligence as well. Just to jump into that a little bit. So that whole problem of trying to make artificial intelligence like a mechanical philosophy, okay? So the more rational the machine is, the more facts it takes in, the more calculations it makes about how it can interact with the world, the more intelligent it is, failed miserably back in the 60s. But now, from my understanding, that's developed into teach the system, say a robotic body, to fall, basically. There's no computation. It's just falling and recovering. Kind of like jump in there, break it, and you learn and you adapt.
Well, yeah. I mean, isn't that the best way to learn? I think we're rediscovering that in AI. We find that force feeding something to learn, with millions and millions of trials isn't necessarily the best, but give it a real world environment and sort of a self-supervised type of learning that happens right in situ. It's kind of hard to artificially create. We can't create test beds or test models of that same type of experience. You have to kind of throw the drone out there and let it crash and collect the data and learn from that. Absolutely. To me, it's all just playing, right? Whether we're talking about AI and technologies or our education or even our social group, all of this stuff that we've talked about today, to me, the piece that's just weaving in and out of all of it is, how do we just get back to playing and doing something fun as humans, whether it's our education or our social experiences or even our political differences. Yeah. We have to bring that experiential part of it back to make it integrative. Otherwise, it's just too easy to fracture out, right? I think. Yeah. Maybe we're forgetting how to play. I think that's maybe something I've thought a lot about.
Wow. So let's wrap it up. But hopefully we can pick this up if that's all right with you. I mean, I've just enjoyed talking to you immensely. I just love your enthusiasm and spirit that you bring into it. But that last thing that you're saying, Arji, about play, I mean, what's so rich in that point is that, again, John is saying, okay, the meaning crisis needs to be dealt with some psychotechnology, which basically has to be of the function of a religion. Which is a fraught problem. I feel uneasy about it, but whatever. But he says that basically religion is serious play.
Right.
So I think you're really onto something there. And by the way, the other thing it made me think of, Aji, is how Björkman says that picking up your individual responsibility is as much of the development process as anything else. And actually, I think John talks about that too as well. Like, as you're going to our topic, as you're becoming an individual, more of an individual, and you're trying to work out that tension with the rest of the community, it's never a case of dropping your responsibility. And I just wanted to say, I'm impressed from your story how, you know, with your family history and everything, you managed to educate yourself and be responsible and, you know, develop into a fine person by all accounts.
Very kind.
Yeah, no, it's impressive and well done.
Well, I've thoroughly enjoyed our conversation. I think we've sprouted probably at least a dozen potential next conversations.
Yeah.
And yeah, I really am grateful for the opportunity to chat and look forward to the next one, Jules. Thank you. I really have appreciated spending this time together. Thank you.
So have I, Archie. Really appreciate your time. So if you want, maybe we can hook up again in a month and do another one, and maybe we can start from whatever you want to, but serious play might be.
Let's talk about play. That's a
Yeah.
great topic.
All right, let's talk about play, man.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
We'll see you. Be well. And we'll see you on the Discord.
Will do. Take care, Archie. Thanks for your time,
Bye.
mate.
Thank you.
I'll
Bye.
stop now.